Andrew and Noreen Brunson were involved in starting churches, training, aid to refugees, and a house of prayer in Turkey for 23 years until being falsely accused of terrorism in October 2016. After this, Andrew was held for 2 years in Turkish prisons. Due to a worldwide prayer movement and significant political pressure from the U.S. government, he was finally sentenced and then dramatically released in October 2018. Andrew has a PhD from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. Andrew and Noreen's ministry, Wave Starters, is focused on the Muslim world, persecuted church, and preparing believers to stand in difficult times. Andrew, on behalf of our whole family here, we're just really honored to have you with us and really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us this morning.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. I think you have a lot of Spanish speakers. Is that correct?
Yes, we've got Jackie doing simultaneous Spanish translation right now.
Pues a todos los de habla español, hola. I grew up in Mexico. I'm a missionary kid, so I speak Spanish. We could do this in Spanish and translate into English instead. Anyway, Jackie asked me to talk about what I see for the year ahead. So that's sort of what I focused in on. If that's wrong, tell me and I will adjust and talk about something else. But as I look at the year ahead, my expectation is that we're accelerating into difficult times and that we need to prepare ourselves and those who are under our care so that they're ready to stand in difficult times. This is something in my imprisonment. I don't think I'm going to go into too much of the imprisonment side. What I'd like to do is speak, and then if you want to do any questions and answers, I'm glad to do that. But very briefly, I was in prison for 2 years in Turkey, and I was surprised that I broke very quickly when I was put into prison, because I was a relatively strong missionary, had a number of threats, death threats, attacks, risks over our time in Turkey. And so I thought I was pretty strong. And then I broke very quickly in prison in many ways, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and also spiritually. I went into crisis with God. And I broke very thoroughly. I was suicidal during my first year. God did rebuild me. My story is not only breaking, it's also the rebuilding process, so that I came out of prison stronger than when I went in and loving God more than before I went to prison. But there was breaking, serious breaking, and I almost did not make it. And I broke numerous times. And so I came to see after I got out that one of the reasons that God allowed me to break so thoroughly and so often was so that in my weakness, I would learn how to strengthen myself so that I could stand and remain faithful. So I had to do this under difficult circumstances. I was the only Christian in the prison. I was always held with very strong Muslims. So I was in many ways alone spiritually. And so in that isolation and loneliness and weakness, I had to strengthen myself to survive spiritually and to remain faithful to the Lord. And so some of the things that I learned, some of the practices, some of the ways of thinking are other people. So God was doing a number of things through my imprisonment, but one of them was preparing me so that I could in turn help to prepare other people who will be under pressure. So when I came back to the United States is when I began to understand this a bit better. On returning, I've never had a burden for the United States. I grew up in Mexico. My parents were missionaries. Then we were in Turkey for 25 years. And I always saw the United States as a place of spiritual safety, you could say, a place where the church is strong. And I'm going to talk in the first 15 minutes or so about the United States to all of those who are not connected to the U.S. It may not be as relevant to you, but actually I think that what happens in the United States is going to affect many places around the world. So bear with me as I talk about the United States, especially. When I came back, I began to get a sense that there had been a tremendous change, a drastic change in the United States, and that there was a wave of persecution that was about to crash onto this country. A friend of mine he is a Presbyterian pastor, theologically conservative, teaches at one of the well-known seminaries in the United States, and is the pastor of a megachurch. And I say that just to underline that this is someone who speaks very carefully and is not used to having dreams from God. But he had a dream from God right before I met him, where there was a large, dark, churning wave on the horizon, and it was being held back by the power of God, but it was soon going to be released. And he and I, the two of us were in that dream, were told to basically build a castle of sand and to guard the word in that place, because this wave was going to be released. And this dream was repeated a couple of times for him in the exact same detail. And after that, we met, and he told me about the dream. And the idea of the building, so it's on this, this wave is getting ready to crash, and we're on like a desert type surface, all this sand, like a beach or desert. And the sand, as he prayed into this, the sand represents the people of God. Often in the Bible, the people of God are talked like sand. And the idea was that we're supposed to bring together people of God in community and build a community, and that it may be this, the love and the unity among believers in these small groups and communities that is going to be very important when the wave hits. And one would think normally a big wave will wash away just a tower built out of sand. But the message behind this was we are supposed to build these communities of faith and unity centered around the Word of God. And God is going to protect this. Even though this big wave hits, God is going to supernaturally protect this. And the point was that there is a sense of timing to this, that it's very soon, that this wave will soon be released. It's a wave of hostility that is going to break on the church, and that we have to prepare ourselves for it so that we can stand through it. So there are other things as well that God spoke to me, showed me, and just even recently, this was quickened in me, that I was imprisoned in part so that I could learn some very important lessons so that I can help other people who will face pressure. And just in the last week, this began to well up in my heart again in a new way, just confirming, even as we entered the new year, that this is something to take very seriously. I even look at a small thing that just stuck in my mind, is that Pope Benedict died on the very last day of 2022, and he was known as someone who was a lover of Jesus Christ and who was conservative theologically. And the very last day of 2022, he dies. And I think there's going to be a change in 2023. That is, some things that maybe he was holding back even by his presence are going to be released, that are going to be very negative. And so I see 2023 as a year of acceleration into difficult times. So when I look at the United States, I believe God has showed this through dreams. He showed it through just speaking into my heart and prophetic words I've received as far as, this wave that is coming. But I think we can also look at the signs of the times. And I want to quickly list some of these. Because I'm not trying to dwell on negative things. I just think that many believers are not, I would say we're very optimistic about the future, and we should be optimistic about the kingdom of God. But I don't see a lot of reason for optimism for example, the American society. And I think that when we talk about revival, because this is something that, especially in intercessory circles and in prophetic circles, certainly in the charismatic church, and I don't know what the background is for most of you here, but in the charismatic church, we tend to talk about victory and glory and triumph a great deal. And I believe that we will have those, but it will be in a context of difficulty. And for example, in Turkey, God showed me that a harvest is coming. Turkey is the largest unevangelized country in the world. It's very dark. It's completely Muslim, was ahead of the Muslim world for centuries. So it's a stronghold of anti-Christianity. So the Lord showed me there's a harvest coming, but that it would come in difficult circumstances. And so one of my concerns is that, so there is this dark churning wave that's getting ready to hit. The danger is that we're not prepared for it. And if we're not prepared, it means we're much more vulnerable and we're in much greater danger of being knocked out. And I say this having come very close to failing under my very difficult testing. I think there is a naivete sometimes that we can think that persecution is only positive. And there are many good things that can come out of persecution, but it's also very, very dangerous. And when Jesus talks about persecution, which he often does, he often, together with it, gives warnings, the need to persevere, how the love of many will grow cold. And so this is a real danger. And if we're not prepared, then when the pressure comes, then we can give in to fear. We can make decisions out of fear. We can become offended at God. This is what almost knocked me out. I became offended at God because I lost all sense of God's presence. After pursuing his presence for years and experiencing it, I lost all sense of his presence, and felt like I was in darkness, experiencing the silence of God for the entire time I was in prison. And this wounded my heart, and I became offended at God, and this led to even questioning his existence and accusing his character. And so I can, with my own example, I know that it's dangerous when we go through persecution, and many people get knocked out. People sometimes say, but look at the Chinese church. And I've heard this in leaders where they say, kind of, go ahead, bring on the persecution. It's going to be good for us. It's just going to, purify the church. And well, it will do that, but it will also knock a lot of people out. They say, look at the church in China. And the church in China has grown under persecution. But I can also point out many places where persecution has silenced the church. North Africa and the Middle East, even Central Asia, in many areas were majority Christian. And then Islam engulfed them. And the church is very, very small there now. Even in China, I met a man who was in prison, one of the fathers of the Chinese church. And he told me about his experiences in prison and being tortured. And so he remained faithful to the Lord under a lot of pressure. And his wife divorced him, and she walked away from the faith. And they had 2 children. The son followed in the father's footsteps. He remained faithful to the Lord under persecution. His daughter followed the mother and slid away from the faith. So there you have the same persecution, but 2 very different responses, even in the same family. And so when I talk about this pressure that's coming, I do it with a sense of urgency that we need to prepare ourselves. And that's why I'm focusing on the signs of the times that point toward the difficulty, because so often we don't hear about that. We only hear about the kingdom coming and the powerful church and the victorious church. And while that is true, we need to give the entire context of that, which is that it is persevering through great difficulty. So this is why I'm focusing on some of these negative things, but I am optimistic about the kingdom of God. Anyway, I think there's been in the United States, I see a change from positive to negative. 20, 30 years ago in the US, Christianity was viewed positively by society. Christian morality was still normative. Not everyone followed Christian moral standards, but those were the standards by which people judged what is right and wrong. And now in our society, being a Christian is a social negative, especially if you're in high status positions. And Christianity in many ways is seen as undermining the social good. And Christian moral standards are clearly repudiated now. They're actually seen as causing damage. So we see a shift in our culture from especially accelerating in the last 15 years or so, especially in the last 10, where Christians are being seen as actually harmful. And then I look at American culture, I think every institution in our society now is post-Christian and increasingly anti-Christian. I look at media and businesses and big tech, the whole educational system, medicine, law, just every single institution you can think of is dominated by people who are not believers and who are actually increasingly anti-Christian in their worldview. And I think that there are two main issues that are going to drive persecution of Christians. This is the same in the States as it would be for other places. And one is the exclusivity of Jesus in salvation, that he makes claims that he is the only way to God. And our culture, our society does not like those claims because they're not inclusive. And the other wedge issue that will drive persecution is that Jesus makes demands on his followers for obedience in a number of areas that are completely against the stream of our culture. In biblical justice, family, marriage, issues of life, sexual morality, and gender identity. Now, I think that actually, so much of our efforts in trying to affect policy, at least in the United States, has been the issue of life and abortion, and it deserves all the attention that it has received. But I think that the main wedge issue is actually going to be, or is already, LGBT and gender ideology. This is what will be primarily used, not abortion, but gender ideology and LGBT issues will be the main wedge issue that will drive persecution. And this is what it will look like. People will say, you are hateful. The things you are saying, the things you believe and think that stand for, these are hateful things. They make people feel unsafe, and therefore you must be silenced and you must be punished. And what comes from that is, for example, saying you can't be in this school, you can't work in this business, you can't be part of this group, you are deplatformed. I think people will be banned. Actually, it's already happening to some people that they will be banned from using credit cards or using financial transaction mechanisms, using banks. So all of these things have actually already happened to some believers, to a small number of believers and ministries. But when we reach a tipping point, then all of these things can be applied to many, many people very quickly across a broad range. And so what we are going to face at the least is social and financial pressure if we remain faithful to the claims of Jesus, that he's the only way to God, and are faithful in obeying the demands that he makes on us. So we will be seen as hateful. And this shouldn't surprise us. Jesus himself was, people said he was demonized. They said he was evil, even though he was the most loving man in all of history. And he said that just as he was hated, that the world would hate us. And the reason this happens is because we carry his scent. If he's living in us, if we're living close to him, we smell like Jesus, and people react to this. And so it should not surprise us, although it does actually when we are persecuted in many places, because we haven't had it in the West in the past. But many people will be surprised, but it should not surprise us when people say that we are hateful. We just want to make sure that this is a slander, that it's not true, that we're full of love and compassion and mercy. But however loving we are, if we stand for Jesus and stand alongside what he teaches, then we will be called hateful. And this is going to bring the pressure. I look at the United States right now. If you look at the book of Revelation, I think chapter 17, 18, something like that, you see a picture of Babylon. And that represented Rome at that time. But basically, a very powerful city that was full of corruption, that had entangled all of the world with itself because of its materialism, and that was seducing many, many different nations. And I look at the United States now. I grew up hearing this. I've lived in countries that are generally anti-American most of my life. As the U.S. is an imperialist. And, I don't think that's necessarily accurate, but I've come to think now that actually the U.S. is acting as a cultural imperialist power, because we are spreading throughout the world this LGBT ideology. And just, sometimes there are times of repentance where people represent their nation and they ask forgiveness of other nations and in intercessory circles. And I just have this increasing, sense that, I need to repent for the sins of my nation, because we are polluting the world. There's enough sin in the world. It's not all related to the United States, but our culture is driving so much of this. And I think there are many godly fathers and mothers around the world who fear the United States because of our entertainment, the power of our social media and of our culture. And we are promoting the LGBT ideology and gender ideology and many other evils throughout the world. We're doing this through our entertainment, but also through our businesses. When American businesses set up in other countries, the people who work for them have to adopt this ideology or they will be fired. And our government is pushing it. I learned some time ago that the U.S. In Africa, for example, before they would tie their aid to their foreign aid to adoption of LGBT policies, pro-LGBT policies. So they were forcing African countries, if they wanted our financial aid, to go against things that against the values in their culture. And so we have become a type of Babylon. And wherever the West has influence, and I think, Europe is already in the same place, further along maybe than we are. There are hate speech laws being introduced in many European countries. Last year, I was in Finland at the trial of Päivi Räsänen, who is a minister of parliament, who is a very well-known public figure in Finland, who was put on trial because she questioned her church supporting a gay pride parade. Here is a person who's been the Minister of the Interior, a high government official in her own country, being put on trial. And at first they wanted 2 years in prison for this, just for tweeting a Bible verse from Romans. I look at Hungary, who is hated in the European Union because they have passed laws protecting young people from LGBT ideology in the schools. So they've said no one under 18, we will not allow this to be taught in our schools. And because of that, they're hated and they're being punished by the EU, withholding funds that they're supposed to receive. Norway, Scotland, passing hate speech laws that will make it illegal to well, basically to state what is a Christian morality and truth. And so I can expect it a bit in Europe, although it's surprising at the same time. But it's spreading to places in Latin America. We have many Latin Americans on this call, perhaps, and there's one Mexican legislator who may be banned because he opposed trans people taking the seats that are reserved for women in the legislature. And so I would not think that this is possible in Mexico. But as I've talked with and been parts of family values meetings with Latin Americans, with lawmakers, legislators from some of those countries, this is what they talk about. The pressure is coming in places where we didn't expect it before, that have been culturally conservative. And so the United States has been driving much of this. And for all Americans on this call, this makes us ripe for judgment. This really sets us up for judgment as a nation, because we are polluting, we are leading many people into sin. And so this is something very serious that we need to be repenting for. And I think that we are already under judgment at some level, but it may become a much more serious judgment in the very near future. So this is where we are as a culture right now. And I don't think there are any reasons to think it's going to get better, because when we look at the millennial generation and Gen Z, they have, I was talking to a senior leader of a movement, and he said, Andrew, the revival has already started. And I said, well, anecdotally, yes, we can give, stories of people who are coming into the church, baptisms and all of that, and praise God for that, because however bad things are, God is always at work. There are always victories. But if you look at the numbers in the United States, the church has not recovered after COVID. Many people got used to not being part of a body, and attendance has significantly dropped off. The millennials, high percentages, higher than ever before in history, are leaving the church and they're not coming back. Gen Z, let me tell you something about Gen Z. 51% believe that the gender binary is outdated. Around 40% identify as LGBT. 41% support censorship of hate speech. 66% support shouting down speakers they consider offensive. And 23% support using violence to silence such speakers. So who do you think they're talking about? They're talking about us. We will be the ones who are accused of hate speech. And many people in the younger generations are in complete agreement that we need to be silenced, and if necessary, violence should be used against us. And the last thing I want to highlight in the United States is a future of religious freedom. A Supreme Court Justice Alito recently said, he said, it's hard to convince people that religious liberty is worth defending if they don't think that religion is a good thing that deserves protection. With so many people increasingly thinking that religion, especially Christianity, is a negative, who's going to want to defend religious liberty? And increasingly, what's also religious liberty is being seen as an issue of the political right. Also, because in the past, religious liberty was considered a human right that was defended by the left and the right to some degree. But the left is increasingly seeing the right as being the one interested in religious freedom. And so that's very dangerous, because it means that people on the political left are no longer going to support religious liberty in the same way. And at least in the United States, our law schools, the elite law schools, are functionally atheistic. People now have a lot of hope in judges. We say we have robust protections, but that can change very quickly. And how well do you think the legal system is going to defend religious freedom in the future if the judges usually the judges are appointed, they're trained in the elite law schools here. If the elite law schools are atheistic, many people at that level now, they have no contact with Christians, and they don't understand how someone could think the way a Christian does. And so it's just very foreign to them. And they're not going to defend our religious freedom in the future. So I think we're going to see a lot of the things that we've depended on to guard our freedoms are going to come under pressure. Now, I want to move from the United States to just general trends that I think should concern us and show where we're headed as far as increasing pressure coming in the world. Because it's not only pressure in the United States, although what happens in the United States will affect many things around the world. So the first trend I see is with COVID, that this was used by governments all over the world to exert more control in their countries. And this is especially concerning in the West, where there's been an emphasis on personal freedoms. But COVID was used in the Western democracies, especially for government to take more control. Now that they've done it once, they can do it again. Those things are in place. So this is something I think that shows where we're headed in the future. A second trend or issue that is going to affect us is the weaponization of the Western financial system against Russia. So whatever you think of Russia and Ukraine, I think what Russia did is very evil in invading Ukraine. But the response from the United States and from Western Europe was to knock them out of the financial system that's run by the West, but is used by the entire world, from the SWIFT system of bank transactions. So basically, their banks were cut off from international transactions. Russians who were vacationing in Indonesia suddenly found that they're stuck because their credit cards no longer work. The credit card companies, which sanctions didn't require that they leave Russia, but they did, and people just suddenly everything stopped working and they were cut off. Now, what's important in this is that most of the countries in the world, the largest countries in the world, are not sanctioning Russia. And you look at the largest, China and India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Mexico. I know I've missed another one there. But some of these, the largest in population, are not sanctioning Russia. And what they're doing is looking at what happened with this weaponization of the financial system and thinking, we need to set up an alternative system so that the West cannot do this to us. And so two things I want to point out. First is that the same way that Russians were seen as evil and the financial system was weaponized against them and they were cut off, Christians will be seen in the same way in the future. And the same things will be applied to them. But something of further consequence is, as I mentioned, many countries around the world are looking at how this system was used against Russia, and they don't want to expose themselves to the same danger. And so there are a number of them now who will be looking for ways to set up a financial system. And this is going to have, it is going to accelerate the world breaking up more into regions, and there being different sources of power and competing systems. And so I think we're going to see that there will be, well, this is going to lead to a lot more chaos and a lot more fragmentation in the world, with all of the consequences that will bring. So a third area is central bank digital currencies. Now, this isn't cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrencies are a completely different thing. A central bank digital currency is one that is run by the central bank of a nation. And so they are official digital currencies. And China is working very hard on rolling theirs out. There are already a number of people using it. The European Union is developing one very quickly. The United States is also very quickly developing their digital currency. Now, I know someone who is involved at a very high level in the world of finance, both in government and in private finance. And his company has developed a system for digital currencies. And he meets with heads of government around the world, trying to get them to adopt his system rather than the Chinese system, because his system will provide more personal protection for information. But the point I want to make is that this is coming very quickly. It's not a matter of will it happen, but when will it happen? And I just read recently, you may have heard of the downfall of FTX, this big cryptocurrency trading place. And there are now calls in government to accelerate the adoption of a digital currency. Now, these are not related to each other, but they're looking for excuses and reasons to roll this out. And what will happen with this is we already see what happens in China. You may know about the persecution rising in China, and they combine a surveillance state. They have cameras all over the place that have facial recognition, and they are using artificial intelligence and their systems to coordinate and be able to work very quickly. And they basically follow people with their surveillance. They also have a system of social credit, where if you do things that the government approves of, you receive points. If you do things they disapprove of, your credit is lowered. And as your social credit is lowered, they restrict you so that you cannot use public transportation, cannot buy tickets to get on an airplane or a bus or a train, so that you can't purchase things. They can freeze your bank account so that you can't have transactions. They keep your children from going to school. You can't work. So they basically, they still put people in prison, but they don't have to put you in prison, because they can just imprison you in your own home and cut you off from the world and all transactions. And so we see what can happen when countries begin to roll these things out. And what this would do is give an unprecedented degree of control to government over where you can spend your money and how much you can spend, and they can basically cut you off whenever they want. And so this is something that's coming very, very soon. Of course, they will say that the intentions are good and it's just for security, but it can also be weaponized very quickly. I also mentioned the decline of religious freedom in the United States before. And I want to give an example of how this affects internationally. In 2018, my daughter Jacqueline spoke at an event organized by the United States government. And I think there were something like 60 countries present at a gathering to promote religious freedom at a very high level. And my daughter was invited to speak because I was in prison in Turkey, and she was there to speak about my detention. A year later, in 2019, I spoke at that gathering, a ministerial for religious freedom organized by the U.S. government. And I was able to speak because now I had been released. And there were over 100 countries represented at a high level, represented by their foreign ministers or by their ambassadors. And so this is a pretty amazing thing. 100 countries around the world gathered together to talk about religious freedom. And many of them don't care about religious freedom, but they were joining because of the political pressure on them by the U.S. government. Now, in 2019, I spoke to representatives from 100 countries under the new American administration. This was canceled. completely canceled. And you think, why would they cancel something that has so much momentum? 100 countries getting together to agree that they will promote religious freedom. Why was it canceled? Because it really isn't a value for the United States government, and it's not a value for the West. And so what can we expect from this? That as the West, and especially the United States, as we turn away from religious freedom, that this is going to lead to increased persecution around the world. At this point, there are still governments that respond to pressure from the West. I think that the West is not going to pressure anymore. Even if you look at the World Cup and many of the things that were written about Qatar and the pressure that came on them, none of it was about religious freedom. And, that they don't allow freedom of religion. It was all about LGBT. And a leader in a Middle Eastern country that we were visiting said to me, Andrew, when the United States is everywhere pushing LGBT in our country, then they lose all credibility to talk about human rights. And we basically will tune them out. So as the West and the US turn away from religious freedom and promote things that are evil, then this means that it's going to release increased persecution around the world. Some of the things that have kept persecution back will be removed. I also think that as the US goes into decline as a culture, as a society, that this is going to lead to some very negative things around the world. When the US was declining in the 1970s, the fall of Saigon in Vietnam, then Laos and Cambodia turned to communism. The Shah was overthrown. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, Grenada moved over to the Soviet bloc. There was a rise of communism in Europe. And so I'm not saying that the United States is always a good force. What I'm saying is that as the United States declines, because we're entering a period of decline, then we can expect that around the world, darkness is going to increase, chaos will increase, oppression and violence and hunger and death are going to increase. And so this is what I see coming. Now, what to do? Because I don't want to discourage you. I want us to have a sober view of the world and of our place in it, and for my country, the United States, and what's coming for us. But for those who are not in the U.S., who may not even like the United States, what happens here will affect the church around the world. And so I want to encourage you on this call to prepare yourself to stand. And especially for those who are prophetic, what are the prophets saying? I look at the last few years and I think that the prophetic, I'm talking about major prophetic figures that have a national platform maybe, or whose voices are amplified, is I think the prophetic movement missed COVID for the most part, with some exceptions maybe. And there were many of the Trump prophecies that also in some way were very confusing and that they missed. And now I see this wall coming, this dark wave about to hit. And I think, are the prophets speaking about this? And so this is what I would say to the prophets, that as I listen to the prophetic, prophecy is oriented toward the positive, toward victory, toward the glory of God, toward the kingdom coming. And this is right, and that is God's perspective. God does see things positively. He knows the end. He knows all of the things that he is working out, even in the midst of great chaos and darkness. But if the prophetic is only speaking about the glory and the increase in anointing and the victories, but they're not giving the wider context. Well, if you're prophetic, then you need to give the wider context and not just give the positive, but give also the negative, the darkness that is surrounding it, within which that glory is going to burst out. And if you're not giving the entire picture, then you're not preparing God's people. You're not preparing God's sheep. And so I'm not a prophet, and I really value prophetic people. And my cry to the prophetic people is, if you're not seeing these things, then ask God to show you. It's possible that many prophets are not seeing what's coming. And that's a problem if they're not, because they're supposed to see so that they can sound the alarm for the body of Christ, and they can encourage us and get us focused on the right things. But if you are seeing, but you're not explaining, then it's like saying peace, peace when there is no peace. And so my call to the prophetic and to intercessors as well is ask God to show you what's coming so that you can prepare the people that you are responsible for, and for prophetic people to sound the alarm for the shepherds, because the shepherds ultimately are the ones who have to shepherd the sheep. And we need to wake up the shepherds and say, look what's coming. I'm not a prophet. I receive prophetic words. God has shown me some things about this, but I look at the signs of the times as well. And Jesus said we need to be able to interpret what's happening. We need to be able to look at the world around us and see some of what's developing and what God is going to be doing in the midst of it. And so right now, my call is my encouragement is let's sound the alarm, not to scare people. I'm not trying to frighten anyone. I want us to be sober-minded, because if we begin to prepare our hearts now, then when the pressure comes, we're much more likely to stand. We won't be as afraid. I've heard Mike Bickle say, since you're a prayer movement, you've all heard of Mike Bickle, and I love Mike. But he said, we prepare ahead of time so that we're not afraid. And I said to him, Mike, I prepare ahead of time so that when I am afraid, I don't run. Because maybe you won't be afraid, but I have been very afraid, and I expect to be afraid in the future. It's when there is pressure, when there is a threat, it's very normal for the heart to start to beat faster, for a burst of adrenaline to go through your body. It's hard to avoid that. But are we going to respond out of fear? Are we going to make our decisions according to fear? No. The reason we prepare ahead of time and make decisions ahead of time and ground ourselves strongly in relationship to Jesus and truth is so that when we are afraid, we stand our ground and we do not run. And so I want to encourage you. I've talked about the darkness coming, revival. As I said, I have friends people I really respect, who talk about revival. And I say, yes, revival. But first, before we get a revival fire, we're going to have a refining fire. And Satan, this wave of dark wave of persecution, it's his spirit and anger trying to destroy the church. He will not succeed, because God will also use this persecution, this wave of persecution, to refine the church. And so what comes out of this is going to be very, very beautiful. I could talk with you for an hour about the good things that came out of my persecution, how God rebuilt my heart. There's some very, very good things. But we have to survive the persecution so that those things can happen. I want to leave you with one verse that to me, summarizes a lot of this. Daniel 11:32. Daniel is speaking to the people who will live in the most difficult times. And he says, the people who know their God shall stand and accomplish exploits. And we're often focused on the exploits. How do we grow? How do we rebuild? How do we expand? But right now, this is a time to focus on know your God. If you know your God, you will stand. Do you want to stand in difficult times? Focus on knowing your God. And as I said, we tend to focus on the exploits. We need to be standing so that we can accomplish exploits. And as I see this dark wave coming, I also believe that there's going to be a powerful move of God. God is going to work very powerfully. Some of my favorite verses in the Bible are Isaiah 60, verses 1 through 3, where it talks about deep darkness, the darkest darkness descending on the earth. And it is in that context then that the glory of God is poured out on the church. And then these people in darkness are attracted to the glory of the church. It doesn't even say the glory of God, it's the glory of the church, the light in believers. And so as we go into this time of darkness, there's going to be pressure. There's going to be an exodus from the church. Many people are not going to be willing to pay a price, to pay the cost of following Jesus and standing for him. What's going to happen is that those who are willing to, they will remain faithful and they will be beautiful and purified. And we're going to have a beautiful church, very powerful. I believe that we're coming into a time, there's a timing to this, apart from faith and all of those things, in God's timing, where we're going to see a very powerful church, not only in love and act, but also in signs and wonders and miracles. I think we're coming into a time of that. There's going to be a beautiful, beautiful church. There's going to be an exodus from the church, but then this purified church, there are going to be many people in darkness and in chaos and in hopelessness, and they're going to look to this shining, shining church. And then we're going to see that revival where many people come in. So I think that's the sequence. Pressure, refining of the church, and then a revival. Throughout all of that, during the time of great pressure as well, God will be working. But those are the trends that I see. And so sometimes after I speak, someone will come up and say, great, I got your message. Now we need to do more evangelism. I say, no, that is not what I mean. I spent my life doing evangelism. We always do evangelism. This is not the time to focus on evangelism. It's a time to strengthen the foundation. Make sure that you know your God. If you know your God, you will stand, and then you will be ready to carry out assignments, to receive assignments from God and expand his kingdom. So that is my word right now to you.
Thanks so much for being with us today. This has been really valuable, and I think a lot of the points you're bringing up hit a lot on things that we hit on here as well. So it really, really resonates, and really appreciate you sharing with us and just your stand and your life in general. Really grateful for you being with us.